Well, everybody, welcome to this week's Crowdcast. Thank you, everybody, very much for coming. Especially thank you to our guest, Dr. Caley Smith. We met in 2007 when we were both studying in the linguistics program at the University of Georgia. Both got our master's degrees there from Dr. Jared Klein. And we've met other people from that same program on this little Crowdcast show before. We've had Dr. Luke Gordon and Dr. Tony Yates. Dr. Smith happened to go on to Harvard, where he earned his PhD focusing on the ancient languages and literature of India and Iran, such as Sanskrit and Avestan. Caley, would you like to kick us off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your work and what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm currently the Sanskrit lecturer at the University of Washington, which is a ton of fun. Basically, what I do, I would say research-wise, is I look at performativity, that is the nature of poetic and ritual performance in the earliest indo-iranian contexts. And so, I work on ancient ritual and I work on ancient poetic performance, and I try and understand from the perspective of those materials, what did they think rituals did? What did they think poetic performance did? That sort of a thing.
That is a fascinating line of work. So can you give us an example of some of your findings here, like what you find rituals are doing in this cultural context?
Sure. So I guess, let's see, what's like a good explosive nugget. So in Sanskrit, for example, the past tense of a verb is usually marked with a little prefix in front of it, as it is in Greek, called the augment. But weirdly enough, in Vedic, often the augment is missing. And in fact, it's usually missing in Avestan. So people wondered, hey, what the heck is this all about? And what I was looking at the time was how the poetic performer who's sort of doing a ritual, doing a speech, how does he refer to the space around himself? And, how does he say, for example, I offer this sacrificial offering into this fire? And so I was looking at what's called deixis, the way that the speaker establishes things spatially and temporally, that is, in terms of time and space, near to himself, near to his audience, and near to third-party, what we might think of as fixed landmarks. And so what I was interested in is whatever they're talking about, how are they also necessarily talking about the place where they happen to be talking? So there's actually, a lot of this was inspired by work on Old Norse, as it happens. It was a guy named Lars Lönnrot who coined the term double scene. And so what I was interested in was when you have some ancient poem where Indra shows up at a sacrifice and this god, Indra, starts speaking to the people there. Isn't it interesting that he shows up to a sacrifice when presumably this poem is being performed also at a sacrifice? So the degree to which what's happening, the scene and setting of a narrative, is doubled in the actual social occasion in which it would be performed. That's what I was interested in. So let me wheel back to that weird thing called the augment. What I found was, in addition to these poems making heavy use of deixis to actually say things like, this is the weapon of Indra. And who knows exactly what they're talking about, but he's referring to something in his hand, right? So presumably some ritual implement. That's what I was looking for. Well, what I found was there's a host of these kinds of verbs that lack the augment, and their usage is not accidental. They seem to be almost always trying to refer to some past event as though it were present. So a very famous example is there's a root vad, to kill. And there's this great hymn where Indra is bragging about himself. It's one of the great boasts of Indra. And he says, Vadim Vertram. Now, if he was saying, I did kill Indra, he should have said, Avadim Vertram. But instead he says, Vadim Vertram, which is not marked for past tense. But it's also not marked for the present tense. It's marked for neither. It's temporally ambiguous. And so one of the things that I've argued is that Vedic poetry and ultimately Indo-Iranian poetry is highly reenactive. And it's attempting to fold together the memory of legendary past events and sort of recreate them vividly in front of their audience in the present. And that's what's going on when Indra says, Vadim Vertram. It's not just some guy named Indra who said, I killed Vertra in the past. It's also a human performer pretending to be Indra, impersonating him and making it vivid by saying, I kill Vertra right now. Vertra is this horrible cosmic snake that pins up all the waters, so humans have no water. Um, you know, like everybody knows, everybody's got a cosmic snake problem, and you need someone to deal with it.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
in the Rig Veda, that's Indra.
yeah, and of course that specific myth has some interesting echoes in the myth of Thor's fight with Jormungandr. Right, so the cosmic servant up in Northern Europe. That is really interesting. So in a sense, it's like it's it's not even a historical present. It's sort of independent of both present and past. It's this weirdly kind of like cosmic, almost gnomic, timeless event. That's very cool. And of course, Lars Linderoth is one of the great mid-century scholars of the Eddas, and worked on similar things with Old Norse, where you don't have such a consistent use of tense. Old Norse vacillates much more between present and past without having that kind of tenseless state that you find in Indo-Iranian.
So all my material is drawn from close study of the Vedas themselves, and of course also the Gothas, which are the oldest part of the Avestan corpus.
Can you give us a capsule definition of the Vedas and the Gothas?
Sure. The Vedas, we often think of the Vedas as texts specifically, but that's a bit of a misnomer. The Vedas are kind of a conceptual category within which there are texts. So when I say the Rig Veda, that's how I typically refer to an anthology of 128 hymns. In fact, it's actually two texts. One is the Urk Samhita, which is the anthology of all the verses, and it's spoken in fast speech, which means that there's phonotactic transformations between all the words. For example, I never go up to someone and say, "Oh, Jackson, what did you do?" I would say, "What'd you do last night?" And I would say, "What'd you do?" instead of "What did you do?" because there's no sort of glottal pause after every word. Well, in Sanskrit, the texts always are represented phonetically in the way that you would speak them in an actual speaking context. Well, what we think of as the Rig Veda comes down to us in two proof texts. They're orally memorized and passed down, usually father to son, although sometimes teacher to son. A little ambiguous because I think a lot of ideas of patrilineality in early India are not, strictly speaking, biological. So when someone teaches you the knowledge, they are kind of your father, as it were. But we get two source texts, the Urk Samhita, which is the fast speech of 1028 hymns, and the other one is the Urk Padapata, the recitation of the words of the verses. And there a small glottal stop is placed after every word so that you would get them all out of context. It's like having two versions of the Lord's Prayer, and in one, how it would be like an audio recording of how someone would speak it, and in the other one, it would be with these stilted pauses instead of saying, instead of, if someone were to say, "Forgive us our trespasses," you'd say, "Forgive us our trespasses," with little breaks. So because of those duplicate copies, the text is highly, highly faithful and seems to be unchanged for about 3,000 years. So that's the oldest text. The other Vedas, there are three other Vedas, although really the Atharva Veda is kind of the outlier here. At some point in time, all this poetic material was collected and redacted into what we think of as the Rig Veda, and its purpose was to be recited at various large social occasions, kind of like big festivals, at which there would be the pressing of Soma, a kind of intoxicating drink, and then the coronation. I really shouldn't say coronation. I should say the consecration, because that's really what it was. They were consecrating someone who was the chief of a clan to be temporarily chieftain of all the clans. So we could think of this as the Vedic king, but it's a temporary position, and it's really more like a war chief for the summer. And then your term expires after a year, and hopefully you might be able to get elected again, as it were. It's complicated. I'm happy to go into the sort of socio-political dimensions of ancient Vedic society, but these texts were not collected because they were thought of as strictly speaking religious texts. They were political texts. They were ceremonial texts that were used to do things in large public assemblies. These people, like me, live in isolation in the mountains usually, and in the summer that was great because you have plenty of grass, and in the winter it wasn't so great because without grass you can't feed your cattle and your goats and your sheep, and so they entered a period of communal living. The problem is, during the summer, you probably went on a classic cattle raid against your neighbors, or you might have maybe kidnapped a daughter or two or something. Who knows? Anyway, there's a lot of beef between these clans, and the beef has to get quashed for them to live communally together in the winter. And that means you're going to need some kind of a, well, not a sovereign, because sovereigns have a lot of power that I don't want to impute here. Something like a suzerain or a hegemon, someone who's going to be the lord of the clans and functions as a kind of arbiter. And everyone respects his authority for the period of cohabitation so that you can quash those beefs. Otherwise, the cycle of petty revenge could spin out of control like it does in the Oresteia. And you don't want that. And I'd love to talk more about revenge. But instead, I wanted to mention what these other Vedas are. The Sama Veda is like a version of the Rig Veda with long protracted vowels. It's sung by the chorus in these big ceremonies. The Yajur Veda is a bunch of mnemonic sacrificial formulae, which the person who does all the ritual work, which is the terrible job, the guy who does the task of building an altar out of bricks or measuring it so that the dimensions reflect the dimensions of the patron of the sacrifice, the guy who actually has to chop off the head of the animal, all that work is done by a Yajurveda. And in order to remember everything, he has his own Veda, which is basically a bunch of dedicatory sentences, usually in prose, not in verse. So you would say something like, I do this for the wind, I do this for the fire, I do this for you, Indra. And these are keyed in time to all these various ritual things you do, and you have to do them in the right order or you get a bad sacrifice. Finally, the Atharva Veda is full of incantations and spells. People are really interested in it because it seems highly archaic, but it's kind of the odd man out because it's not really a part of this large socio-political ceremonial event. In fact, it seems like they were kind of on the outskirts. And for a long time, other texts only refer to the Atharva Veda as the Atharva Angirasa. That text, which belongs to the Angirases, who are this ancient race of proto-human singers, and the Atharvans, the fire priests. And they don't call it a Veda. And so a lot of Atharva Vedic secondary texts and commentarial texts are like, actually, the Atharva Veda is the best of the Vedas. And it takes them a long time to get included as the fourth Veda. Which is why you see so many times, you might see a lot of names, a lot of last names like Trivedi, and this means someone who's from a family that's memorized all three Vedas. That fourth Veda, evidently much less important. And the fourth Veda, the Atharva Veda, never makes it to the south of India, as far as we can tell. When this sort of migration out of North India happens, we don't see Atharva Vedic families in the south. So it's sort of an interesting late add.
And the composition of all these texts, are we talking about like 1000 BC thereabouts?
This is tricky, and I hate dating the Vedas, but I'll do it. A lot of people say somewhere between 1700 and 1000 BC. And let me tell you why you should use those numbers, but also be deeply skeptical of them. The reason we have a hard upper limit is this. There was once a civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization. They don't seem to know what horses are, and the Rig Veda never talks about them. So there's this assumption that there's a hard upper limit to when the Indic peoples could have migrated into India. Okay, but isn't it possible that they just didn't like those guys in the cities and didn't consider them worthy of poetic composition? Or maybe they actually stayed in the mountains and the cities are mainly coastal. Could it be that they just didn't care that much for each other? So there's lots of other possibilities. The reason I put a hard limit at around the 14th century, 13th century BC is because we have these great tablets in Syria that have to do with these guys called the Mitanni. They were a vassal kingdom of the Hittites, and it looks like some Indic peoples, because they have cool Sanskrit-looking names, and they worship gods like Varuna, Mitra, and Indra. They seem to have been a client mercenary army of the Hittites. When they conquered the area of Syria and set up their capital, they basically assimilated, just like Franks assimilated to Romance speakers in France. But they kept their names, and it's possible they kept other things that would have been in an ancient indo-iranian language. We're not totally certain, but we've never found the Mitanni capital or the royal archives because they're somewhere in Syria, and it's not a great time to go. So that we have texts that, because they're in the Near East, we can conclusively date them to things like Tikuli tablet where this guy's like, all right, you morons, this is how you want to race a horse. You can't just feed your horse. He'll overheat and die. You've got to starve him. Then you race him. And then when he completes the lap, you throw your wet blankets on him so he can cool down. But don't feed him ahead of time or the food will make him overheat. So it's actually quite a detailed horse racing manual, and it uses a lot of Sanskrit technical terms. For example, Ikwatna. And this is why people think it's Indic and not Iranian. You see, there's this linguistic element, I, that gets various suffixes. And in Avestan, Iwa is the word for one. But in Sanskrit, what would have been Iwa becomes Ava, and it's grammaticalized to an adverb status, and it means only or just, which makes a lot of sense. One, only. The word for one is Eka, which is the same I element, which is somewhat pleonastic. And anyway,
you're breaking up occasionally.
Okay, so the evidence of Ikwatna in that tablet suggests it might more likely be an Indic text instead of Iranian, but it could also be before there was sort of a sundering of those two languages. So we're not sure, but it is a good hard upper limit. Now, the other thing is that we find evidence of iron in India around the 10th century, and the Atharva Veda seems to know the difference between loha, that is metal. So okay. just so that I could make one comment on when, with this upper limit of how old the Vedas are, I tend to think 1200, 1000. But again, these dates are just kind of best guesstimates. I wouldn't sell my soul for based on that as collateral. And the reason is that well, here's an example, right? So let's say that we find iron in 1000 BCE in India, and the Atharva Veda knows the difference between Krishna IS, black metal, and Loha IS, red metal. Okay, so it knows the difference between copper and iron, presumably. And you don't see that in the Rig Veda. Does that mean the Rig Veda is a late Bronze Age text that precedes iron? The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So I think that's a weak argument. The other thing I don't like is if you look at the Iliad is definitely an Iron Age text, and it mentions iron. But when it does when it mentions iron, it's some of the worst poetry. You know what its best poetry is? It's when it talks about bronze and gold armor. Like, gold armor is basically useless, but it's so good at describing it. So maybe we shouldn't look at the presence or absence of materials in poetic reference as any kind of indication that the material culture should reflect, right? It's also possible that if iron's new in the Iliad, they might not have been used to describing it in cool ways yet. They were so used to describing the beautiful reds and golden colors of bronze. So, basically we use this as our kind of tentative window, but I don't like it very much. A lot of it also has to do with how we deal with these other texts. So I told you there's a Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, Atharva Veda. The core of those texts that I called Samhitas, which means the anthology, the collection, those are the oldest parts, and they're the parts that are actually verbally uttered in ritual performance. However, there are also other texts that follow them called Brahmanas, and the Brahmana means basically a commentary. It's a sacred commentary. The Brahmanas are subdivided into the oldest part, which is the Brahmana. We also call the middle part the Aranyaka, which is the forest book, and usually has to do with rituals that are considered a little more dangerous and so should be done outside of public sphere. And then finally, the Upanishads, which are the secret texts and almost always depict their teaching as a one-on-one master-to-pupil teaching. This is where the oldest Upanishads get its start, and then the Upanishads take off as a kind of mystical revelation genre that continues after the close of the Vedic period. Because the Rig Veda and these Brahmanas seem to sometimes think of the ritual in very different ways, scholars have generally thought there must be intervening generations between the layers of text to account for how confused they could be. For example, svadha is a word that's cognate with Greek ethos, right? And sva means self, da means place. So self-place is basically the Vedic word for self-determination or self-rule. Usually it applies to a clan's ability to be independent and free and not under the yoke of some master. Great. Well, in the Brahmanas, svadha is a special ritual drink you drink. And so some people would say, look at how confused they were. They mistranslated. They misunderstood this word svata. It's supposed to mean freedom, and instead they think it's a beverage. Well, I think that's short-sighted. I think that instead they understood that there was a polysemy to poetry, and that the ritual drink was symbolic of freedom because you would only participate in a symposium, in a co-drinking event, if you notionally at least did it of your own volition, right? Nobody's like,
Right.
you subjugated me, I follow you. They would drink this drink as a symbol of them being like, yeah, this guy's our leader now. And maybe actually there was a lot of like there was a lot of brutal politics in play. But for the sake of the ritual, that's when political legitimacy is established. So I think they understood, and in fact, they theorized these triple levels. They call one layer of meaning Adidaiva or Adidevata, that means macrocosmic, basically. It means pertaining to the heavens, so the gods. Adiyajna, pertaining to the sacrifice, and Adiyatmya, pertaining to the self. So the idea is that any of these things, any of these mantras, these sacred words, has three possible domains of application. That is, it could mean something mythological. Indra defeats the snake Vrtra. It could mean something social. Indra defeating the snake Vrtra also means our Lord, our suzerain, our Vedic king, has defeated the resistance, because that's what Vrtra means. It's to a root vr, which means to enclose. Tra is a suffix of instrument. So Vrtra really is a constrictor, a resistance. And so it's a constrictor in the sense of a snake. It's also a constrictor. It's the resistance to his accession to the throne, if you will. So socially, Indra defeating Vrtra is like him unifying the clans and them subordinating themselves to his rulership. And personally, if you're a poet, Indra defeating Vrtra and releasing the waters to flow for mankind is the act of overcoming writer's block. It's not writing because it's oral; it's a pre-literate culture, but it's releasing the sacred verses in performance. And so, basically, we have to think very polysemously about the poetic language. And what that means is that simple assertions like, oh, the people of the Brahmanas were ignorant and didn't understand the Vedas. Well, they understood them in a certain way to do certain things. And I don't think we can infer easily that they were ignorant of texts that preceded them. But you have to assume ignorance if you're going to jam a few generations in between every layer of the text, between Samhitas and Brahmanas and Aranyakas and Upanishads, and then a few more generations so that you can get to the one concrete.
You went silent.
Okay, so my wife drove
now you're
up
on again.
My wife drove up, and because I'm Bluetooth to the car, it immediately grabbed the voice.
Okay.
But we're back.
So you've given us kind of an overview of the Vedas and some of the associated literature. Can you talk about the Gothas a little bit before we get to some other questions?
Yeah, totally. I just want to sorry, I'm reading this question. Yes. So the Gothas are sort of a similar but slightly different situation, and I want to stress that the similarities that they're both orally passed down for a long time. Legends that go along with the Gothas, with the Yesnya, is that it was once written down but destroyed by Alexander the Great, and so on and so forth. And in both cases, it seems like these compendiums of text resisted being written down, even after writing came to those regions, because the Gothas in Iran, I mean, there was writing. We have cuneiform. Why weren't they written down? There was a resistance to writing. We could imagine this for a few reasons, but I think in part, if we want to be sort of economic about it, is that, it's likely that priests and poets were not literate. And so writing these things down was sort of ceding their proprietary family ancestral knowledge to have to deal with these scribes, which is a competing class of professional. So the Avesta is not written down, and the Rig Veda is not written down. And in fact, our earliest texts of the Avesta are around 1000 CE.
Right.
And our earliest texts of the Vedas the earliest one I've seen was from the 12th or 13th century CE. Yeah. So passed down orally along and still performed to this day. Now, we don't have the interesting thing about the Vedas is they're extrapolated. So if you're going to do a ritual, you can't just look at a Veda, even if it was printed out in front of you, even if you memorized it. You have to know how to do the ritual, and you have to know how to select the right verses for the right occasion, usually by a complicated process of metonymy, to select what kind of verses could be relevant to this. And by now, the way it's done is relatively fixed, but that was not always so. It was once quite fluid. And being an embodiment of the Vedas gave you a lot of authority to improvise on the ritual. In the Avesta, however, our oldest copies of the ritual or of the text are already in ritual form. There's the 72 chapter Yasna, and the Gothas are 5 poems that are interspersed inside of them. And so the text that this was basically instead of being a data repository in the way the Vedas are, the Yasna is like script. When it comes to the Avesta, you kind of have to do a bit more sleuthing to piece apart. The 5 Gothas do not exist as one collection. They're embedded in the 72 chapter Yasna, which is cognate with Sanskrit yajna, the sacrifice. There probably were a lot of different versions of that Yasna. But the one we have is the 72 chapter one, and right smack dab in the middle is the 7 chapter Yasna, the Yasna Haptang Haiti, the 7 chapter Yasna, and that's not in meter. It's in a very archaic language, but it's in a kind of special, like, I don't know how to say it, solemn prose, and it's extremely interesting because it's right in the middle. And one of the things that I like to look at when I try and make sense of ritual performance as a script is, just like a song often goes verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus. There are sort of patterns and structures to the way these things do. Rituals have syntax. And so I'm always looking for what's centrally located, what's chiasmatically placed around that central axis. There's a lot of research on this by 2 scholars in the Sanskrit domain. One is Joel Brereton, who just retired from UT Austin, and Stephanie Jamison from UCLA. They look at things called omphalos, which is when a poem seems to have a central focus in the center, and then you see a bunch of ring compositions around that central focus. And the idea is basically that these are structuring devices used to build up anticipation to some sort of secret reveal, and then sort of resolve it afterwards. So it's always interesting. That's in one poem, but I think that it could be a relevant way of looking at larger liturgical structures. So there's a lot of weird stuff. That's worth looking at in there, including not just content, but form, because form has a lot of content. For comparison, think about I'm going to butcher this, but I believe it's the Codex Regius, right? That's the version of the Eddas that starts with this Volva who's talking to Odin. And also, by the way, all the sons of Heimdall in attendance. And isn't it interesting, if we just took that away by itself and looked at it, we would say, what an interesting scene, a little dialogue between this woman and Odin. And she's like, I know Odin knows all this stuff, but check me out, I know it too. The fact that it's at the very beginning of this poetic Eddas seems to me that it's working almost like, not exactly like a table of contents, but it changes how you should read the rest of the text, because it's in the context of this larger exegetical act by this Volva. So if I can just be comparative for a minute, those are the kinds of things that you want to look at when you're looking at large liturgical structures. What texts are being put in whose mouths? What is the content of form? So that's another thing I do with the Rig Veda, and I want to do more in the Avesta, because I've done a lot more work on the Vedas, obviously, just by the amount of time I've spent talking about them. But the Vedas also have really interesting and complex internal structure. For example, the Rig Veda is divided into 10 books, mandalas, circles. And within that division, there are these 7 inner books. And those inner books are structured very peculiarly. That is, fix that in post. They start off with the hymns addressed to the most hymns addressed to a given god. So first all your Agni hymns, then all your Indra hymns. And then within that, longest hymns to shortest. And then within that, longest meters to shortest. And so it's this parallel structure. It's been heavily redacted and arranged for a particular reason. And each of those 7 books is associated with a primordial seer. So it's very interesting, just like the Volva, that we have all these hymns organized with who they're associated with as the sort of primordial cosmic revealer, and then within that structured in order of importance of deity. So these are the kinds of things that I like to look at and think about to try and figure out what was going on in these guys' heads, and how did they understand the world, and how did this make sense for them for what they wanted to do with these texts as social objects, if you will.
And I mean, and obviously this has been a really fruitful direction of research for you. And I think people can find you on academia.edu in some of your papers there, right?
Yeah, and I'm hoping I'm hoping in the next year to crank out some more fun things that are, on related topics, but also, I don't just do this sort of research with the Vedas because I'm sort of comparative and I look at oral culture and oral poetic recitation. So I have some things I'm hoping eventually will come out where you can actually see not just similar phenomenon, but using the same poetic formula happening in such diverse texts as the early Shaivite Pashupata Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, the Lotus Sutra, which is an important Mahayana Buddhist text. A lot of times, these kinds of acts of self-assertion, impersonation, and organization according to who's speaking really help you understand a lot about what this text is trying to do for its imagined audience.
I mean, like I said, what an infinite direction of research that's got to be. And of course, you can do it with every other branch. I mean, not a ton of this sort of stuff has been done with Old Norse, except, some mid-century scholars like Lars Lindroth kind of pursued this sort of direction, but it's not a big direction of research right now. John was asking, is there a notation in the manuscripts themselves that gives an indication of two reenactors? So the comparison is in the Poetic Edda, the poem Lokasena, where Loki insults the gods. There's what could be taken as kind of stage directions in the margins that show who's speaking, because usually that's not indicated in these poetic texts. Is there something like that shows like who's? Is there a notation for the reenactors or the performers in these texts?
As external paratext notation, no, there is not, because all we really have is a memorized corpus of what you would say on the ritual ground. And remember, because this is preliterate, there's no opportunity to scrawl in the liner notes like we have in the ski reens where someone's like, yeah, Jesus, whatever. So we have nothing like that. So everything that I work on, I try and look at the systematic and selective use of deictic pronouns that refer to near me, near you, that kind of thing. The use of tense. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to get explicit stuff like a nominal absolute clause that says something like, and then the legendary Utri put the eye of the sun into the sky. This is being the priest who does the offering with mere reverence. And then we have like a nice equation where like, aha, the priest who's doing this offering is reenacting Utri doing this mythological deed. But usually, you have to look at you have to sort of, you have to pay very, very close attention to the use of deixis. That's what it's built on, because there are no liner notes whatsoever. And already by the time that we start to get our first commentaries, 5th century Skandisvaman is we have a partial survival of his commentary. But most people use the commentary of Sayana, which is 14th century. And Sayana's got other objectives. For him, everything is like a nature god, and he's really only interested in that layer. We're now very far removed from the socio-political context. Sayana is a commentator for the Vijayanagara Empire, right? So he lives in a beautiful, gorgeous city with temples that go many, many, many stories skyward, and is a highly urban, sophisticated society, very different than the bucolic life of the Vedic peoples. Sure. So as the socio-political situation changes, it becomes difficult for us for commentators, I think, to imagine what the social implication of these texts are, although they often have a lot of insight into the symbolic and mythological meanings.
Interesting. And of course, something similar in the Old Testament, it can be very difficult to look at some of those rules in, say, Deuteronomy or Leviticus and understand the reason. But of course, we're in such a different cultural context that we may never be able to kind of put ourselves in the shoes where those rules come from. I just lost it. Can you expand on the striking similarities between the Germanic or Norse story of Odin and his brother slaying Ymir, and thus making the world out of his body parts, with the Vedic establishment of the practice of yajna, as explained in the Vedic hymn Purusha Sukto, where the Purusha allows itself to be sacrificed by the Devas as a means to establish the creation of the cosmos?
Absolutely. I just hope I have enough power the remains. So it's actually quite a common myth of a giant sacrifice to explain the formation and creation of the world. But what's interesting in the Rig Vedic context is this is not our oldest cosmogony. So I'm going to put a pin in that for a second to just say, yes, in addition to Ymir, we also have things like there's a great old church Slavonic story where this book falls out of space and no one can read it, no one can lift it, and it's too big. And then St. Peter opens it up and says, oh yeah, this is the book of the dove. It says how the world was created. In the beginning, God turned the wind, made his breath into the wind and his eye into the sun. And it basically reads exactly like a kind of giant sacrifice myth, but in this case, highly Christian.
Caley.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, suddenly you're within doors.
Yes, I came inside. I thought that might help.
Well, you when we last saw you, the sun was kind of gloriously setting upon your golden mane there.
Yeah, it does that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Daily events.
Is the sound and video okay?
It's okay for me. What do people think over there? Okay, people say yes. Okay, so as you were.
So when it comes to giant sacrifices, they're all over the place and they're great. There's even a really great one in Aztec mythology. I want to say it's Aztec mythology. I hope I'm not confusing those two. But basically, it's a giant world crocodile, and you sacrifice him, and then you build the first cosmic house out of it, and therefore the world. So it's very, very common, be it a giant animal or a giant person. What's really interesting to me is that the oldest cosmogony we have actually for in the Rig Veda is not a giant sacrifice. Linguistically, the oldest one is that they're celebrating this story in which Indra, together with the Angirases. Remember, I said there are these like ancient singers, and I kind of called them proto-humans.
You said proto-human, yeah. That was curious, yeah.
The reason is that they're immortals. So they're not quite humans, but they are humans because they're the ancestors of humans. You see, part of the story is that after they help Indra open Vala Cave and release the dawn and all the cows and all the light, which starts the year, it basically sets time in motion, the Apsaras, these celestial sexy nymphs, are so impressed with the Angirases that they say, let's bed them, and together, like an alloy like an alloy, will mesh together two metals. I'm trying to remember what metals. Probably the ones that make bronze, but potentially it could have been silver and gold to make electrum. I'm blanking. But, so they say, yeah, let's create the human race. So these Angirases and these Apsarases are basically the forefathers of the human race. And they're never named, but they seem to be 7 in number, which is real convenient because in the Rig Vedic Soma pressing, there's 7 priests. And it seems like this is kind of a reenacted element of that journey to Vala Cave. And the stories vary. Sometimes Indra strikes open the cave and breaks it open. But more often, it's the Angirases who sing the cave open with a horrible sound. They're described as Gora, dreadful. So anyway, that's kind of like why you need to do this gosh darn ritual after all, because the world is getting terrible because of winter. The universe is dying, and we need to revivify it, just like at that crucial moment when Vala Cave opened and set everything in motion. So it's a restoration. There's also the summer festival in which Indra beats Vrtra, and there the Angirases do not really play a role. So anyway, the oldest cosmogonic story, and I have something coming out about this because I have an article coming out about how the Vedas came to be understood as authoritative. Well, our earliest cases of cosmogony don't involve a giant sacrifice. It's the legendary Indra and his exploits, and these happen at specific times in the calendar, in the ritual calendar, and they're reenacted. So why this giant sacrifice? Well, here's my sort of working theory. Now, you'll bear with me on this hypothesis. We know that the Vedic peoples think of themselves as the Panchajana, as these 5 folks. And they're dispersed in the summer, and they collect in the winter. And they seem to have a temporary form of sovereignty, right? Well, maybe that sovereignty is renewed year by year. But somehow, centuries later, we're eventually going to get to hereditary monarchies in the Gangetic plain after the rise of urbanization. And when you're born a crown prince, you don't need a special ritual really that convinces you you're different. I think we can see ample evidence of that if you talk to someone who's born into sufficient wealth, that they know they're not you.
Right.
My experience.
Right.
So
we've both taught at some fancy colleges, yeah.
so
yeah, we've both met those people. Okay.
you know, as an immigrant of humble origins, I sense the difference.
Oh, I forget that you're an immigrant. That's
so
man, anyway.
You know, but basically, we have to try and imagine what kind of scenario produced what I think of as not just tribal alliances, but longer-term tribal alliances. Something like, you know, people. I don't throw around the term confederacy very lightly, but if we just use it in the abstract, a confederation, a union, a semi-permanent alliance. If over time there seems to be evidence that the Vedic people stopped thinking of their ruling as kingship as seasonal and more as annual. And as time goes on, we see a more complex sort of ritual system arising. We have to wonder why and how, especially if they're still using poems from the Rig Vedic period in rituals that are being done with these other Vedas that seem to be composed slightly later, perhaps for a slightly different audience. So here's my working hypothesis. As time went on, new elites and new patrons and new, more powerful little kings, you know, think about like Irish kings, you know, there's hundreds of them. Little kings with more permanent status need new rituals to confer upon them authenticity and legitimacy, right? I need to be legitimated by a ceremony. So I say, hey, you priests, hey, you poets, you do this sort of thing, do it for me. Well, the ritual now must be slightly different. The context is a little different. But if I'm a ritual sacrificer, then I've got kind of this hereditary intellectual property. I know the Veda. And if I can apply that to new ritual circumstances, then I can change the ritual a little for new context. But there's a problem. What if my poem was about Indra and the Angirases? What if I need to change the application of sacred literature to new ritual contexts? This is where the giant sacrifice hymn is so crucial, because for the first time, instead of the hymns of the Rig Veda being passed down father to son from the times of the Angirases, we're told no. At the beginning of time, the gods sacrificed a giant, and from his body came the seasons, and from his body came horses and goats and cattle, from his body came all the social classes, and from his body came the urcha, the verses, the saman, the melodies, the yajus, the sacrificial formula, and the chandas, the meters. So we're told now that actually the origin for all this stuff is before the Angirases, is before Indra and Balakev. It's this primordial sacrificial giant. It's kind of like a charter myth for a much more broad, expansive program that's going to be the basis of a triple Vedic type of sacrifice. And I see that as basically a new way of building a kind of ritual franchise that's going to be able to outcompete other ritualists by saying, actually, our stuff is sourced in something far more primordial and ancient. Having said that, why exactly the giant? Why the body of the giant? Well, the body of the giant, I think, is synonymous with the guy who patronizes the sacrifice. In a way, the giant is kind of a ritual substitute for him. And what's really interesting is there's a Middle Vedic ritual called the Tanunaptra, and in it, Indra says, "Hey, we got to beat these anti-gods, the Asuras." So all the gods put their bodies in his body, and we're told that his body, the body of Indra, is the body of the sun. The sun, the body of Indra, these are often metaphors for the alliance itself. And Indra is very much the personification of that alliance because he's a divine war chief, if you will. Or you could call him the Summer King. I prefer that than war chief because he's not just engaged in war all the time. He knows a lot of riddles and all sorts of cool stuff. I don't want to typecast Indra. He's a really complex and interesting figure.
It's funny how much knowing riddles is a mark of kingship in many of these different Indo-European cultures, yeah. Just thinking about Heidrecker and Norse tradition. Sorry.
So anyway, that's like, I think it's deeply related to the impersonation element, right? Like if you imagine a war god and you never impersonate him, that's easy. He's like your king, maybe. But if you have to speak as Indra, then the way you perform Indra, the way you perform the gods is always going to be a little bit more like how you are. And if you're a poet, that means your gods are going to be a little bit more poetastic, if you will.
Right.
So it's important. It also makes sure that only you can speak as Indra. Because if Indra knows riddles and he knows, there are plenty of Vedic hymns that are a dialogue between a poet and Indra and they exchange riddles. This is a one-man show. Who's a person who's switching between two personas. The Iron, the Greek Iron, the person who pretends not to know, and says, Indra, I'm too stupid. I don't get it. Explain it to me. And then Indra tells him a riddle and then unpacks it for him. But of course, it's the human poet who's developing these riddles and pretending he doesn't understand them to make sure that these came straight from Indra. They came from the gods.
Right. I see. Sure.
So basically, I think as the social context changed, they needed a new charter myth that was more primordial than the Valakave myth, and that was the Purusha Sukto, which was so perfect because the Purusha doubles as the same as the king. When we're told the Purusha is created by Viraj, which is basically sovereignty, and the Purusha creates Viraj. They have this relationship. And who else would have that relationship but the king? And I say king in a very sort of ambiguous way because sovereignty differs from time to time and place to place. And what's really interesting is outside the Tanunaptra, there's a really great passage in Rig Veda 1.132, and it's the last line. It's praised Indra as basically his ability to beat Vrtra. He's the summer king. He's awesome. But then they say, listen, don't you worry. If you think Indra is just the summer king, Indra is the king of those on the move, summertime, and the settled ones, wintertime. He wraps around the people like the rim of a wheel.
Huh.
So he contains the people. And the wheel is often also a symbol for the year. Other hymns talk about how the year comes a-rolling, and it's got 360 pegs, and around it's got three naves, which are they always talk about 3 seasons because they don't want to talk about winter because it's a little taboo, because it's a bad time.
Huh.
So if you take the Tanunaptra, if you take the Purusha Sukta, I want to throw in a couple other things. There's this really interesting ritual called the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, and it dates to the end of this period. If we look at what happens in that ritual, the horse is attended to by 4 women. And what I think is going on here is that the horse, clearly as the upper limit of masculinity, symbolizes the patron of the sacrifice. The 4 women, however, in their femininity and in the fact that they're on the margins, represent the clans that are subordinate to the new sovereign. And the horse sacrifice is really a big victory lap where you sort of let this horse go free for a couple of years and he gets to eat whatever he wants and mates with whatever mare he wants. And you have a tiny army that follows him, by the way, that's collecting tribute. So we have a lot of metaphors where the body of something very masculine, be it Indra or the Purusha or the horse, is somehow synonymous with the patron of the sacrifice. And then we see different ways that entity relates to the rest of the world, whether he's masculine, the rest of the world is feminine, or, what's really interesting is the Purusha Sukta is taken as the charter myth for the caste system, because when the primordial man is sacrificed, from his mouth comes the Brahman, from his arms come the Rajanya, from his thighs come the Vaishya, and from his feet come the Shudra. And so people say, look, the social system comes from this. Although they never call it Varna, the word for caste system, or Jati, the other word for station of birth. And I'm very skeptical of that because to me, people say, look at these 4 people. I see a 5th person. And the 5th person is the Purusha, who contains, just as Indra contains like the rim of a wheel, all the parts of society. What I see is not a system of social status. What I see is a guest-host relationship. And the Purusha, as the sovereign, is the host. To those he contains are all the different types of guests he could have. And we still don't really understand what that means. The fact that a later system decided to pick those technical terms and build a caste system around it does not necessarily mean we should retroject that anachronistic reading onto this hymn itself. Because actually it's quite coherent with other metaphors of Vedic society as a body. The tribal alliance is the body of Indra, the tribal alliance as the body of the sun, the tribal alliance as the body of the sacrificial horse. In this case, instead of having 4 guests, there would be 4 women attending to the horse. And this makes sense because the way the Vedic peoples refer to themselves is Panchajana, the 5 folks.
Right.
And the way this is usually understood is that whoever happens to be the Vedic king is the central direction, and everyone else is either respective to him, north, west, east, or south. So you're always 5 people, no matter who's in charge, because someone's always going to be north, east, south, or west of you. So what's the center that's moving is the political power center, not necessarily a geographic center. That's one theory of what Panchajana means. So I think all these metaphors for the body as synonymous with society, not only are they coherent, but they make sense cross-linguistically too. If you read, I mean, now it's a very, very old book, but it's still a very good book. Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger, where she talks about how we conceptualize the human body as a double for the entirety of society. When people are concerned about pollution of the body and corruption, let's say, of the corruption of the body, they're often actually echoing anxiety about something happening in society. Whether it's, like you said, like Leviticus or Deuteronomy's prohibitions against what makes you impure as a person, reflecting anxieties about society, right? We're going to be the people that don't eat this as opposed to the people that do eat this. Right. Or in a more modern context, like look at the way France banned the burqa, or the burkini, I mean, at the beach. They didn't say that this was oppressive to women. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not saying it is. All I'm saying is the way the French government banned the burkini on the beach was by saying it was unhygienic. Right? So the problem is something's dirty with the body because of this, and therefore it can't be allowed into social spaces. So I'm not trying to make policy here. All I'm saying is that conceptually, cognitively, we often see the body of an individual as a double for the body of the society. We even talk about it that way. We talk about the body politic.
Right.
The same thing as when Plato says a person has 3 appetites, 3 types of dispositions within their body. Well, also a proper run Callipolis, the beautiful city, is the same way. You have these 3 classes of people, and it's like the body of a giant, if you will. So, I mean, that's...
Bringing it right back. That's cool. Question here. Eric had asked what Soma is, if you could give us a capsule definition of that. And then Yuki had asked, in connection with that, do you think that Mimir's well and the meat of poetry in Norse myth might be related to Soma or Hauma in indo-iranian religion?
Well, I think I can sort of do both of those at the same time, which is conceptually, yes. Pharmacologically, I don't care. And let me specify what I mean by I don't care.
Right.
The word soma is to a root su, to press. So it's literally the extract. Now the question is there a particular pharmacological substance that was extracted? And historically, at some period of time, yes. But I think it probably varied a lot from community to community, and probably in some cases involved more than one plant. Now, what's interesting to me is not Soma so much as the need to find exceptions when you can't get your hands on Soma. So there's this great text, I want to say it's in the Jaiminiya Brahmana, but it might be in the Taittiriya Aranyaka. And in the Jaiminiya Brahmana, I think, they say, hey, listen, if you don't have Soma, why not use this mushroom? Why? Well, remember that time Indra was fighting Vrtra, and then he lost his footing, and he stepped backwards, and he stepped on this mushroom for support. Therefore, you can use this mushroom for support. So not only do I think that it was something that was greatly in flux all the time, but I think that there were so many possible exceptions and modifications. What was important is that there was a drink, and that drink made you feel something, and it gave legitimacy and an embodied sense of something changing in the ritual. Because remember, the purpose of the ritual is the king drinks Soma, and he goes from being Joe Sixpack to a terrestrial embodiment of Indra. He is the Magavan. Magavan is an epithet of Indra. It's also what the human lord is called, because it means the guy who's in charge of what? The Maga, the gift exchange. So Indra's the lord of the gift exchange. And you become that when the Ratnins, the gift bearers, bestow upon you that kind of authenticity. You do the ritual, you drink the Soma. All that matters is you feel something. And you can do that with fermented mead. You could do that with an intoxicating drink. You could do that with what a lot of people think is ephedra. That is, grind up a bunch of Sudafed and see what happens. But, within reason. What I mean is that I think it's less important exactly what it was than that there was this conceptual real estate. There is a magical, powerful drink. And when you drink it, like Asterix in Asterix and Obelix, you become this sort of invincible being. for however long it lasts. Don't be like Obelix. Don't fall in the pot, or you'll be permanently strong and possibly a little. Anyway, so what we do know, the way that the effects are described of Soma, no one ever sleeps on Soma, which suggests it's some sort of accelerant in that sense. We know that well, there's one really great line from the Avesta where they're criticizing this poetaster, and they say like, "Oh, those mumblers, those blamers, since when did the piss of their intoxication ever destroy anything?" And it's a joke on Vrtrahan, because one of the main things that Indra and Vrtragna in the Avesta does is he's the smasher of obstacles, sometimes very metaphorically, sometimes very concretely. And the idea, presumably they're joking about, is that even the piss of Vrtragna could destroy an obstacle because it's the piss of his intoxication. So what that intoxicant is, I think, matters less than the belief that there is an intoxicant. There is something that makes you mud, and mud is a root that once upon a time in Indo-European meant to get wet, to wet one's whistle, and then in Indo-Iranian specifically to become intoxicated. And now in classical Sanskrit, it means to be slow. And slow sometimes intellectually, but also slow like a river. And the idea is it's like a drunken river that is moving real slow and uneasy. But in the Rig Veda, mud means to be exhilarated from this intoxicating drink. It's the proprietary mental state of Indra. And what's more important than exactly what Soma is, and by the way, Soma is always called Raja Soma, King Soma, because he's the kingmaker, is that it makes you feel like Indra. And no matter what it is, if it makes you feel like Indra, it's Soma. As the texts often tell us, here's the proof when Soma speaks from within you. So Soma was also understood to give you incredible poetic abilities too. Beyond that, it keeps you awake at night and that it gives you poetic powers. To me, everyone always asks me, and no one should feel bad about asking me what Soma is. I get that question a lot. And I just actually not that long ago gave a talk at the University of Chicago, and so like the top PhD students were there, and they were like, "Could you tell us what Soma is?" And I was like, "I don't care."
Right.
I don't care because I don't do material culture.
Right.
I'm not an archaeologist. What I care about is the way that poets wanted to talk about Soma. And what's so interesting is it's this thing that once you go through the ritual and drink this drink, you believe. You're a believer. You went from a state of thinking like, I'm in charge of my extended family and I own these cows, to I'm the lord of the goddamn alliance. I'm Indra in the flesh. And this summer is my summer.
Right. So it's, no, that's very well put. And I think, I deal with the same sort of thing. It reminds me of all the speculation there is around what causes the berserkers to go into their trance. I don't know. No, there's.
Can it be the power of positivity?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing actually in any Old Norse text that says they take mushrooms or some herb or whatever. Like, speculate what you want. It's the physical culture of it isn't really my domain, and it's not particularly relevant to its place in story or myth. And I guess it's similar to Soma. But Soma does seem to have a similar mythical place in some degree to Otharir, right, as the question was asking about, because, of course, poetry and drunkenness are connected in Old Norse too, right? Like in the saga of Eroad, where we see a poetry contest where each man gets drunker and drunker and just keeps composing poems, or Odin, who's associated with both drunkenness and poetry. Anyway, it's an old Indo-European thing.
What I should say, though, is that Soma is definitely not alcoholic. Because
and that's interesting.
Contrasted with Surah, which is spirituous liquor. And in addition, I should say that I've been doing new research on the social system, and there's some really interesting lines where it says, like, hey, listen, he who vomits his Soma cannot gain Varna. You cannot gain, what's often translated as social estate or caste, and I don't think that's what it means. But he who vomits his Soma can't keep this, and someone who has Varna who vomits their Soma must do an expiation, lest they lose Varna.
Interesting.
So I think it's this kind of, it's an intoxicating, exhilarating drink. Maybe liquid meth, who knows? But the point is that whatever it is, you soak this plant in water, you crush out the goo, you cook it, and then you got to filter it, and it goes from a state of being brown. You mix milk and honey in, you cook it all together, and then you filter it. And so what's filtered out is the soma. So the process, there is a whole mandala of Rig Vedic hymns to Soma Pavamana, the purified Soma. So only the purified Soma. And I think what it is a kind of communal, altered state of consciousness. And what's important is that it's communal. It doesn't matter if it's being drunken or if it's being, on methamphetamines or what it is that we're all undergoing this state together.
Right.
And that lends authenticity, a feeling of realness to the ritual. That means like, you know what, I guess this guy really is. I guess
right.
It adds a great deal of persuasion to the whole event. But it's interesting that it's not alcohol, and sometimes the criticism of alcohol is interesting because what it suggests to me is that maybe there were other groups that used alcohol as their sacred drink that might have been still using mead, and these are rivals because there's a story where like Indra kills this guy. I'm not going to go into the details, but when he cuts off his head, out of his mouth pours like soma, but out of his ass pours alcohol. So it's the worst of the two drinks. And they definitely knew how to make it because even the Rig Vedic text talks a little bit about how you build an alembic. They built them with hooves, horse hooves and cow hooves, to make these little containers. They could build an alembic and distill liquor. So they're definitely drinking it. And all throughout the period, we're told, even in the classical period, in the Hitopadesha, it says, listen, of all the great vices, 4 vices are royal vices. Let's see if I remember them all. Gambling, alcohol, hunting, and slumming. Because apparently kings like to cruise on villages and pick up women.
Okay.
4th royal vice. Hey, not me. This is the Hitopadesha. Blame
Right. That was
Or that was a Panchatantra.
You're very quick to disclaim that, but okay. So I'm going to try to grab some.
I don't make second. I no longer assign that to second year Sanskrit students.
It's probably for the best.
No.
Do you want to try to take some more of these questions from the previous
Sure.
Crowdcast window? All right. I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Well, eventually I'll get hungry and then I'll go eat dinner.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you sticking with us, and thank you everybody else who's sticking with us too. Cameron Patterson had asked, and some of these questions are kind of going back to when you were answering others. I saw an interesting graphic mapping the tribal and river names mentioned in the Rig Veda. It reveals a triangle of land in the far northwest of India and part of Pakistan. Do you think that's a reliable indication of where the society which composed the Rig Veda actually lived?
Yes and no. It could be. The thing is for some river names, I feel like they're pretty actually reliable toponyms. For example, the Shatudri is a river that is now the Sutlej. And because we have later versions of it where a kind of folk etymology has happened to the name, we can sort of verify the Shatudri is probably not a Sanskrit. It's like a borrowing. It's not a native Sanskrit word, and that means it might be a reliable toponym. Some, however, are not. For example, the Indus River takes its name from the Sindhu. Well, Sindhu in Rig Veda just means river. It's the Sarasvati. Supposedly, this in the Vedic period seems to be a river that went through dried up in the Tar desert. Well, Sarasvati is with a suffix vat. It's a feminine e, and it means the one that possesses all the sarases, the ponds. So it really means the lady with the ponds. You could almost say the lady of the lake, but not quite. Well, what's interesting is if you look at Avestan sources, they kind of have a similar name for a river, but different rivers. And I suspect there are a couple mythological rivers that every time you get to a new area, you're like, oh yeah, this is a tributary of that river. It goes all the way up to heaven, and that connects to the Milky Way. So there are some names that I don't think are reliable toponyms because they bear so much mythological weight that rivers are going to get renamed that. I mean, think about it. If we go to, who's a Ray Bradbury fan? If you like the short story, Their Eyes Reflect with Gold, it's about these Martian colonists. And they've named all these Martian sites after things from Earth. Like, those are the Washington Mountains. This will be the Lincoln Canyon. And then, I won't spoil any of the story for you because I loved it as a youth and it's still good. So I think some toponyms are like that. And that means they get named and renamed and renamed.
Sure.
those are not reliable. But some I do think are reliable. And I typically think the problem is that this number 7 is a special number. Remember I said there were 7 priests in the Vedic Soma pressing, the Rig Vedic Soma pressing? There's 16 in the later one. 7 is kind of a number of completion. You know, I always say there's 7 continents, there's 7 seas. In Iranian, there are 7 regions that make up the world. And for the Rig Vedic peoples, they talk about the 7 rivers. And I'm not sure if we're supposed to think of those as 7 historical rivers, or if we're supposed to think of 7 constituting a totality of the Vedic imagined world. 7 rivers span this world, and maybe we live on a couple of them. You know, usually people try and live between 2 rivers because that's the most fertile place. That's what a doab is. When we talk about the Gangetic Plain, we're talking about the Gangetic doab, which is you know, the area of 2 waters between the Ganges and the Yamuna. And the Punjab is the area of the 5 rivers. So, you know, so sometimes toponyms are reliable, but sometimes I don't think they're that reliable. And also 7 is a tricky number because of its symbolic totality value. What's that from? Probably the 7 days of the lunar week. I mean, if you have a lunar calendar, 7's an important number, and you run your week by it. So it would make sense that every 7 number of things adds up to a dark they were and golden-eyed. Okay, thank you. It's been a long time.
Vicky's got your back. So Megan Nelson had asked, how much longer would the text be written after the stories were known, or are they contemporaneous? You kind of addressed that in talking, answering the first question.
How much longer would the text?
Like, what's the span between the composition of the text and then being written down? I mean, you talked about this somewhat in answering the first question. So I think
the answer is very long, because you know, I can talk a little bit about the oral technologies used to memorize texts, because these are texts that are committed to memory. And you know, there's a couple places still, if you go to Vedic communities, as I've done some field work in Kerala, where you can go see a Nambudiri community of Jaimaniya Samavedans. And the way that you learn the text is, you know, when you're a little kid, when you're like 12 years old, they sit you down and they grab your head, and then they start reciting. And the thing that's different about Vedic Sanskrit from classical Sanskrit is Vedic Sanskrit has a pitch accent. In fact, it has, you know, arguably 5, but at least 3. That is an udatta. The udatta is the high pitch, the unudatta, the non-high pitch, aka the low pitch, and the svarita, which is the resounding pitch, and usually is a falling accent that is caused when a formerly high-pitched vowel is lost, and it contracts a high-pitch, low-pitch on one syllable, causing this really cool svarita. Well, when you train somebody, you grab that little kid's head, and when you recite the high pitch, you push their head back, and when you recite the low pitch, you pull their head down, and on a svarita, you pull it to the side. So they practice over and over again memorizing, and you spend basically age 12 to 25 memorizing and committing to oral memory perfectly.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. I had never heard of this with the head movements. Huh.
Yeah, I can show you some video. If you want to show people later.
That'd be cool.
But,
yeah.
Actually, if you can Google this now, there's an old 1975 documentary called Altar of Fire. And it's about Fritz Stahl, who was an important anthropologist fieldwork in Kerala. Now, I got to go back and meet Stahl in 2011, shortly before he passed, because we were going to see the same ritual to see if anything had changed. The ritual was called the Agni Chayana. Well, it's a type of Agni Chayana called an Atiratra, the overnight Agni Chayana. It was a 12-day ritual. It was awesome, but I was extremely sunburned and ill-suited to the climate in general. So yeah, people were always asking me like why I had makeup on my face, and I was like, I am literally burnt to death.
Right.
Altar of Fire is
It's
not
not
long,
rouge.
45 minutes. Yeah.
So these kids who are doing this today, just as my quick interposed question, their native language, are they growing up speaking Sanskrit?
Actually, often not. In Kerala, they speak Malayalam. And so one of the things that helps you memorize something is when it doesn't mean anything. Not that people don't learn Sanskrit as a later language, and often Vedic practitioners do. One thing you can do if you memorize a Veda is there's always a temple looking for you to recite the Vedas and do various sort of gymnastic tricks, which is there are all sorts of elaborate, cool recitation styles. Like instead of just saying the words A, B, C, D, There are styles where you would say A B C B C D C. There's all sorts of what we would think of as recitational acrobatics. So that's one thing you can do. You can also learn the later text. Very few people actually go on to become ritualists per se. But if you're in a Vedic family, there's a chance that you get to memorize the Vedic text, even if you go on to do IT tech and never become a Vedic priest. Or you might study Sanskrit independently of that and become interested. But what's really interesting is Vedic Sanskrit ceased to really be a spoken language pretty rapidly. We know that because, already our first actual texts that are written down in India are from the 3rd century, the Ashokan inscriptions, and they're already in a very advanced stage of Middle Indic. So it's likely that Sanskrit started off being someone's second language, not but a few centuries after the Vedic period. And what that means is when something's not your primary language, you pay attention to the sound above all else. And this means you're extremely good at preserving the text. You're not very good when you have an opinion, right? This is the problem of monkish emendation. If I'm a monk and I've got a copy of the thing and there's a word I don't recognize, rather than preserve that archaism, I'll think like, somebody screwed this up, scratch that out, and I'll correct it to what I think is correct. But what I think is correct has erased the complication of history. Right? So when you're looking at manuscripts, the thing that looks the craziest is often the most archaic because it hasn't been rationalized and reanalyzed by later copyists. The same is true for the oral tradition. When you don't understand, when you're not fluent in the language you're memorizing, you're a much better copyist verbally. And you have much high, and if you learn Sanskrit as a second language later on in life and can use it, that's great. But what seems to happen very early on is since Panini, who was this brilliant 4th century grammarian who theorized the classical Sanskrit language, there was a distinction between Samskrita, the Sanskrit language, and Chandasa, the metrical language of the Vedas. And by separating those two things, it creates kind of a mental divide where you can do Sanskrit, but you also don't impose your Sanskrit judgments on the sacred language of the Vedas.
Okay, interesting.
Emanates from time immemorial. So what you think is good Sanskrit doesn't necessarily mean you have the right to correct Chandasa. So the Vedic text remained extremely faithful. There are, of course, permutations, and sometimes people do try to amend the text. Like, for example, with the Atharva Veda, we have 2 recensions. We have the Paipalada Atharva Veda, the Little Pepper Atharva Veda, and the Shaunakya Atharva Veda, the Little Puppy Atharva Veda. These were 2 Vedic schools, and we have different copies of them. And we try and look at the 2 to reconstruct what we think the Proto-Atharva Veda was. So change does happen. But considering it's been 3,000 years, very little change. And the Rig Veda, almost no change at all. It's highly faithful. And what's interesting is when people joke about Max Mueller, because he's the one who first translated the Rig Veda for Western audiences, but people say like what he really did was a critical edition of Sayana, because there's no critical edition to do on the Rig Veda. Every copy of it is the same. You don't have to look at different versions.
I've heard, and I
believe
I've heard that it's basically true that that there's more textual difficulty in getting back to the original text of any Shakespeare play than there is for the Vedas, and I'm sure that's true.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all, because it's remarkable. Like, the thing is that the amazing thing about these texts is we're always discovering new things in them that are predicted by looking comparatively at other Indo-European things. So at things that become completely lost later in classical Sanskrit. Like, for example, the thing that I talked about at the very beginning of this, the augmentless form of the past tense verb, where it doesn't have an augment. And my hypothesis is that it's a temporally unmarked form. Well, in classical Sanskrit, that form survives in only one usage. Ma, which means don't, and then that verb, and it's a formula. So I'd say ma gamat, don't let him go, or stop him from going, depends on which stem you use. But so that form it's all over the place in the Rig Veda. It only sticks around in the classical language in this particular formula of don't do X. So if people had imposed their native language judgments on Vedic Sanskrit, they would have added augments and eliminated completely that category of the verb. The fact that they didn't shows that they were sort of able to say, okay, these texts, and in fact, from the 2nd century, we have formal distinctions between what's Shruti, what's heard, versus what's Smrti, what's remembered. Smrti texts, like law codes, Arthashastra, Dharmashastra, these types of things, they go back to important human authorities. But Shruti texts, aka Vedic texts, all go back, and this is generally a belief of the classical period, specifically of the Mimamsikas. It's not universally held. Naiyayikas believe that the Vedas are of human origin. But Mimamsikas believe that it all, and Vaikaranas also, believe that all the Vedas ultimately are permutations of the cosmic syllable Om. So they're authorless. They're aparusheya. They have the quality of being non-Purusha, which is ironic since there's the Purusha Sukto where all the Vedic stuff comes from the Purushas. No, they're inhuman. They are timeless, authorless. They emerge naturally from the universe. And therefore, you shouldn't apply your linguistic judgments to the Vedas because your linguistic judgments have to do with human things, and the Vedas don't.
It's interesting to note that where you see language unchanging or phrases unchanging in English, it's also in a sacral or near sacral context, right? Till death do us part, which means nothing in 2020 English, right? That's that's just the palest shadow of what you're talking about here with these immense texts left unchanged for so long.
You have to grab the kid's head if you want. You till death do us. You want to have a memorized corpus. You're going to have to tell some kids that they're not going to get to play baseball, and it's time to memorize their pitch accent. I mean, I suspect that. I mean, that must be why we have things like Homer, right?
Right.
The Homerids must have been some class of people that you start them early. You take those kids and you say, guess what? You're memorizing the Iliad. You will not be your days of being a simple shepherd boy are over. It's time to be a Homerid.
Right. Well, and you have to wonder how far back some of those traditions like that go, and if they existed in other Indo-European language traditions too. I mean, we have no trace of anything like that ever explicitly mentioned in, say, Norse, but it's not impossible something like that had existed at some time.
Well, that I think that you remember in Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, I believe he talks about how the Celtic Druids have this vast holy language and liturgy that they won't write down, right? Which works great if you're trying to protect your intellectual property. But what happens when something real serious happens, like a war? Who are the first casualties of war? War spreads sickness. Old people die from sickness. Oral memory is lost. Also, often kids are kidnapped and conscripted, and or turned into or adopted. I mean, that's a traditional thing of human war all the time. You take the kids, and then if you killed their parents, these kids are now slaves, or these kids are now going to be adopted and raised in our homes and then the opportunity to pass on oral text is gone, right? So where I live in Georgia, I'm very close to a place called Etowah and close to a place called Rock Eagle. And when people asked local Cherokees who made this structure, a lot of what local Cherokees said was, we don't know, it's been here forever. And so, early anthropologists hypothesized, oh gosh, this must be from these ancient natives that died out, and then the Cherokee moved in. But actually, later evidence suggested that they'd been built by the Cherokee themselves only like 4 generations previous. Disease, war, famine, these things wipe out old people, and with old people, the great treasure of cultural memory that's stored in them. And then once someone of great learning dies with them. And so the cultural memory of what Rock Eagle was and what it meant to these people was erased, was effaced.
Right, discontinuity within 100 years.
Yeah, terrifying.
Can you still take questions?
Sure.
Okay, I see one here. You can start working on while I go and look at the older one that I thought maybe you could answer fast-ish. Matt Barclay asked, do you have recommendations for learning Vedic Sanskrit?
So there's a lot of actually material out there, and here's the good news. Most of it's public domain because it was published 100 years ago. So,
yeah, but is it all in German?
No.
Okay.
So there's some guys that were Scottish, and they wrote in English. MacDonnell has a Vedic a Vedic grammar for students. He also has basically like a Vedic primer or reader that has some basic Vedic stuff. I have a lot of criticisms of these documents, but fair ones because they're like 100 years old or more in this case. I think it was, a lot of the early work of doing Vedic studies in the West was laid out over 100 years ago, and a lot of it has not been, the pedagogical materials have not been updated. And sadly, a lot of people don't do critical editions of texts anymore because it's various reasons. We have a lot of materials, a lot of text. The thing is that there, instead of like one really good go-to place, instead now scholars produce a book on like the perfect verb in the Vedas, the imperative in the Vedas, and you need to have 100 books to do all that. So it's very difficult.
So on the previous chat, Nero had asked, is there, so again, kind of going back to an older question you were answering, had talked about some of the symbolic impersonation an hour and 45 minutes ago. He was asking if, is any of that carrying over into Zoroastrianism?
So actually, yes. The inspiration for my dissertation, which is called Look at Me, on the mimetic impersonation of Indra. I work on impersonation of Indra. I also work on the impersonation of other primordial figures. I was actually inspired by the Avestas because one of my committee members, a guy named Okter Sherva, worked on how Zarathustra, rather than a figure, so historically we think of Zarathustra as a historical person. He wrote the Gothas orally, and then et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that in the 72 chapter Yasna, you're full of instances where you say, I, Zarathustra, do this, and I, Zarathustra, know this, and here I am, etc. That means that for generations, for centuries, for millennia, there was some priestly performance where a human being was asserting himself to be Zarathustra. And Okter Shervo wrote a great deal about this and was like, listen, what's going on, regardless of if there's a historical Zarathustra or not, there's also the memory of Zarathustra, and that's the figure being embodied and performed in this sort of ritual theater. Now, that's not a very popular view because people feel it's an assault on a historical personage, but you have to understand something about me. I have a very high bar for proof of historical personages. That is, I'm actually kind of like I'm one of those rare people that's on the fence of, was there a Buddha? Because I don't see necessarily the need for there to be a Buddha.
Sure.
Instead, the Buddha is a very powerful idea that allows a community of ascetics to explain themselves and their origins. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't a historical Buddha, in the same way I'm not saying there wasn't a historical Zarathustra. But the reason I started writing about Indra was because I felt this was a way of approaching the problem of impersonation where there would be no question of the historicity of Indra, because Indra's a god. And usually for philologists, texts are the exclusive creation of humans, not of gods. So if a guy's saying, I'm Indra and I do this, we have reason to be a little suspicious this might be a human who's adopting the persona of Indra, right? Now, whether you want to expand that to other human characters, and I would, that's moot. That's why I focused on Indra, and also, Yama, the god of the dead, who's actually just the first human who dies, and he's like, I don't know, what am I going to do now? I know, I'll make a place for the great patriarchs to hang out in symposium, drink under a cool tree all day. Anyway, I think that the impersonation aspect is very, very prominent in the Avesta. I think that it's very prominent in the Vedas. And the more I look, so I'm in talks with some other scholars really doing really interesting work. At the University of Arizona, there's Hang Du. She works on early Chinese literature. At Yale, Jacqueline Weintraub, she has a book. It's called Beyond Orality. That's it. Sorry. And then the pun is in the subtitle. Basically biblical poetry on its own terms. But it's a brilliant book. It's absolutely brilliant book because it says, like, look, when you talk about the book of Proverbs, that is translating the word mishlim, a speech act called, there we go, Beyond Orality. Basically, what is a mashal? And so for a long time, scholars have said mashal is the word for a poem in Hebrew. But it's not actually very much like the ancient Greek or Roman poem because it's not metrical. So there's all sorts of ways of trying to make this fit our modern category of a poem. And what Weintraub does is she's like, what if we just paid really close attention to the texts and tried to figure out what they thought a mashal was? And that's what that book's about. And I think I think it's amazing. But what I've come to see in my own sort of cross-comparative perspective, about which I've not published, is that we have to really reorient our ideas of textuality, because we live in a world where we have a very casual, everyday relationship to text. I can pick up this little sticky pad and read it. I can read a book, and books are dead things. They contain information. In the ancient world, before writing, that wasn't true. If you wanted to hear a text, it came from a person, and that person had to sing it to you or tell it to you. And they had to be able to adopt a source of authority. Otherwise, how do I know that you're not just making it up? No, this was passed down to you. If you look at, that's something basically, I think, going on all over the place. So another thing I look at is, more recently, is these, like I was saying, these 3rd century Ashokan inscriptions. And if you compare those with the inscriptions of Darius, they have often the first person words of this figure. So imagine an Ashokan inscription that says, I, Ashoka, am great. I am your emperor. But also I appreciate the Dharma of the Buddhists and the Brahmins. And also I'm down to eating 2 birds a day. I'm trying, folks. I'm trying to cut down on eating all the birds. Sorry. Right. Anyway, these inscriptions are very personal. They come from Ashoka. But they're often thousands of miles away from Ashoka's capital in what would be modern-day Patna. So, in a different dialect than what he spoke. And the people there could read. So what's the social context for having a monolith that has a first-person account? I'll tell you what I think it is. I think he had a minister there. I think he had an agent that represented his bureaucracy on the ground, and at certain times, I'm not sure what times those are, maybe they were a calendrical, event, this person read that to an assembled audience. And when they read that, they adopted the first-person perspective of Emperor Ashoka and said, I'm Ashoka, even though he wasn't Ashoka. He's doing the same thing the oral tradition's doing. Adopting a perspective in order to transmit a text. Texts are living things in the ancient world. They're animate things. They're not dead. They carry the intelligence and vivacity and animacy of the person who first, composed them. In the Middle Vedic text, we're often the self, there's this really great death rite that I've been looking at in one of the Upanishads. And basically, when a guy's about to die, he calls his son to him and says, son, it's time for the transfer rite. And he puts his hand on him and he says, I put in you my voice. I put in you my sight. I put in you my mind. I put in you my suffering. I put in you my happiness. And so he transfers to his son, starting with voice, the transmission of Vach. He places his voice in his son. Jacqueline Weintraub, who I've invoked before, she's got a really interesting thing. It's very similar to that, a patrilineal rite where, basically to Jacob, instead of Esau, is transmitted this blessing. And the blessing can't be taken back. This thing has been placed in Jacob, and wrongly, but it cannot be removed. Part of this patrilineal transmission of some sort of authority, some sort of text, some sort of speech act. And what's most interesting of all to me is that if we think about it, that father-son rite must have happened before, when that father was himself a boy, and his father placed a vach in him, and so on and so forth back. An unbroken transmission, again and again, imagining, regardless of if it's historical fact or not, in the imagination of an unbroken succession of placing vach in the body of the person that goes all the way back to the Ungirises, maybe, or to the primordial seers. So I think part of what we do as scholars is we have to try and think about the experience of text, the encounter, the textuality of it, what it felt like to hear, what it felt like to compose, what it felt like to memorize and to relate to others and to perform. And if we don't do that, we're going to be assuming that text works the way it works for us, as this dead thing I can scrawl on a piece of paper, instead of the way it worked for them. And I'm not saying it worked the same way for everybody. In different times and places, it was unique. But we have to get inside that imagination if we want to understand why someone would do all this, why someone would commit all these resources to memorizing and performing, why someone would take a 12-year-old and grab his head and say, do it like this, right? That tremendous commitment of resources.
And that strikes me about 2 hours in as a really good wrap-up thought.
Okay.
What do you think? Would you like to take a look on the side for a moment, the text, see if there's any of the shorter questions that we might not have hit? I tried to get to what I could. I saw NH mentioned.
I have a quick point about this question from Yuki. Is it believed that any of these poetic patterns reached from Indo-Iranian cultures to Greek culture, not through their relationship to Pi, but through the Mitannis? We don't know. Actually, it's really complicated because a lot of what we understand about Indo-European poetics comes from the Greeks, and it comes from the Indo-Iranians, right? And if we look historically at the breakdown of the languages, it looks like these guys are actually kind of at the end of they're a great source for a lot of the norms we establish as poetic principles. And then we fill in the gaps with, say, Italo-Celtic poetry. But when we try and reconstruct the oldest layer of Indo-European, our oldest languages are like Tocharian and Hittite. So there's a little bit of an out-of-syncness. We can't really construct just Indo-European, too cool. Instead, we're reconstructing this grammar that's actually older than the poetic institutions. And that complicates what we're doing. For example, both Greek and Indo-Iranian poetry loves chariots. Yet they must have separated from Indo-European prior to the invention of the chariot. So how do they both talk about chariots? And chariots aren't useful on Greek islands. And guess what? They're not useful in the Hindu Kush. So the importance of the chariot as a metaphor for royal political power, I think must resonate from the Near East, right? Where chariots were used in combat, where we see chariots in biblical poetry, Ugaritic poetry, when we see chariots in, Mesopotamia. So things like that, I'm not sure, it's so difficult to measure influence. We always have to be very careful about these things. And we have to imagine the right social context for how it could happen. So there are a lot of unknowns. But that's one of the situations where I'm skeptical that we should necessarily take chariot poetry all the way back to some sort of early Indo-European, because I think the Greeks and Indo-Iranians were no longer part of the same language group when chariots were all the rage, and then chariots stopped being all the rage before we even get our first texts from them.
Right.
And they're just not useful, really. Okay. So it's complicated. But potentially, I mean, people have noticed, for example, a lot of people look to the forebearers of biblical poetry and Ugaritic poetry. You'll get some of that if you read Jacqueline Weintraub's work and of others. Well, in Ugaritic poetry, Baal, he beats up the sons of El to sort of be his real deal guy. He's like a storm god. And who does he beat up? He beats up Yam, the ocean, and he beats up Mut, death, which has been likened to kind of what the Yahweh does in the Bible, right? He beats up the ocean by dividing it. As it were. Anyway, but the point I'm getting at is, isn't it really interesting that three spheres of divine activity, storm, ocean, and death, kind of map onto the Greek world when Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon cast lots to see who would get which sphere? We don't see exactly something like that in Indo-Iranian. So through Anatolia, it's possible that there are vectors for lots of ideas. I'm one of these chicken shit guys. I'm very tentative with the assertions I'll make about contact.
Appropriately.
But I would be remiss if I ruled it out entirely.
Right. I mean, the difference is, and this is something I run into all the time, is it's so hard to say, hey, isn't this an interesting possibility, without people saying, hey, he said it's this way. It's like, I didn't say it was that way. I said this is an interesting possibility and it can't be proven, but it's interesting. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, we both learned that from the same person. You remember what Jared used to say, is he would say, you could go back in time and then come back in a time machine and tell me, guess what? I traveled in time and I discovered language all arose in one place in Africa. And I would say, wow, that's amazing. Or you could go back in time, come back to the present and say, I went back in time and I discovered language actually arose independently in different places over the globe. And I would say, wow, that's amazing. But as amazing as it is, there's nothing I can do with it. Because the knowledge is only as good as my ability to create a really good, well-vetted series of footnotes that explains how I can find these things out and then try and use those claims to do something else. So as cool as it would be, it's not really useful to a scholar unless we can know everything that we feel like we need to know. So the possibility of social contact and transmission, flood myths are all over the world, giant myths all over the world. Sure. Super cool. Useful for thinking about, I think, the way that society uses narrative to reflect on itself. But does it tell us a lot? Does it tell us much about the history of these stories? Does it tell us a great deal about social contact? As yet, I would say we don't have enough information to make those kinds of assertions.
It's and I love you mentioning Jared Klein here because so much of the way that he presented all of this information to us did influence how I have always taught and now how I present things to the public on YouTube and such. I am not trying to compare myself to him, but I did take inspiration from him, and I don't even know if he knows that. I had to write him a letter.
Yeah, I mean, basically, he gave me my start. I was an undergrad at UGA, and I did my MA. So I had him for many years, and, he gave me really the wrong idea about academics and scholars. He led me to believe that they were kind, warm,
yeah, I know.
caring people that
he's such a nice guy, and and he shows up like he would do this traveling show, basically the joys of classical Armenian, right? And he'd go to different university campuses talking about it, and he'd have this huge setup, and he'd do a week of talks, and he'd be literally wearing a tux with a bow tie, right? I mean, he is ready to deliver this wonderful thing, and he's got 5 people there, right? Yeah. And it never mattered to him. He was there. He delivered. He was happy about it. I have never quite captured that joie de vivre, but I wish. Yeah.
I try and tell students interested in becoming grad students and academics, I try and give them what I think is like a less rosy colored view. Always do it if you're doing it for the right reasons, and the right reasons are to know because you're compelled to do it. But don't do it because you think it's a way to go. It's a journey to the middle class, because it is not.
It is not. Well, and don't do it
to the middle class.
And,
but
and by the way,
do try and
Well, I was going to say, and a corollary to that's emerged recently, is it's not like a path to influencer status either, right? I mean, sometimes people are like, "Oh, wow, you reach a lot of people on YouTube." It's like, look at the guys dressing up as Vikings and shouting at you on YouTube about which god you need to be, playing which video game for or whatever today. Like, those people have influence. If you actually compare those numbers, it's like, so it's always going to be a minority pursuit relative to something, and you do it because you want to know and you want to help people know, and that's it, right? Because
I mean, there's no path forward through learning that's going to make sense if you conceive of the world as one where value is something that can be measured by things. But there is a kind of treasure in knowledge, and I think the pursuit of that kind of treasure, even if you toil in poverty, if you understand exactly what you're getting into, because this is what I don't want. I don't want people to think that it's something other than what it is, but if you know what it is, if you know that it's something that feeds you, but not food, then and you're prepared for, because I mean, what is the academy? What is the university system? It's a modern monastery, right? And then, so here's a book you should all be reading. It's called Memoirs of a Tibetan Lama, and it's a history. It's a biography of a guy who grew up in the 20s and 30s of Tibet and how he entered the monastery. And if you want to reflect on the strange phenomenon of a theocracy whose chief monasteries are also the capital and the most complex banking system, not only is it historically interesting, by Lobsang Gyatso, not only is it extremely interesting, but for me, I think it's a great way of reflecting on what the kind of institution these institutions of learning are. They're monasteries, but they no longer promise salvation of any sort. That's up to you.
So. Yeah, that's well put. No, I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of comparisons to the priesthood in academia. We got to have you back. Maybe we can do another one of these in a few months on orality, on sacrifice. I mean, there's so many themes we could touch on here. All right, let's do this again.
Okay.
Dr. Caley Smith.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for your time.